Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for all folks coming here, braving both maybe late nights on football games and icy sidewalks. As you can tell, this is not actually from screaming about the game. Unfortunately, I think I may be getting a cold here. But I am thrilled to be able to welcome you here for an event that we are doing with IBM on artificial intelligence and its implications for our federal government. Before we get to the report, however, I am very pleased to be able to introduce Congressman Pete Olson from the 22nd Congressional District in Texas. I just had the pleasure of having a nice conversation with him. Congressman Olson is a big believer in AI. He is one of the founders of the Bipartisan Artificial Intelligence Caucus. He understands the opportunity that AI presents and also the challenges for educating people about those opportunities and how to actually achieve them. And with no further ado, it's my great honor to be able to introduce Congressman. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Peter, and good morning. For my Texans here, howdy, y'all. And thank you to the Partnership for Public Service and IBM for inviting me here to join you this morning. My background, very briefly, I went to Rice University, got a BA in computer science, 1985. I never worked a job in computer science because I didn't want to work in the North Pole. And that day, these huge mainframe computers were it. And they had to be kept very, very cold, 55 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. And that meant that I was a scary dude walking through a parking lot in Houston, Texas, 95 degrees, 95% humidity, with a fur parka in my hand. And dinosaurs like me were viewed as having not a BA, but a BS in AI. But as everyone here knows, AI is not BS. It is no longer the future. It is our future right now. It's already here and playing a leading role in shaping our society and our culture. AI has the potential to transform America with critical advantages in the global market through safety innovations like self-driving cars that reduce crashes, save lives, give mobility to people who've lost it, like combat wounded veterans and senior citizens. It can also help the diagnosis and treatment of life-saving medical procedures. But what's not being discussed currently in the world of AI is how we can transform the way we govern. AI has the ability to provide lawmakers like me with up-to-date information, leading to better informed decisions. And since AI never, ever forgets, its constant review of the effectiveness of policy gives lawmakers and government officials the opportunity to be proactive and address issues as they first crop up, and not wait to deal with them years and years later when the problems get much, much, much bigger. At a time when our approval in Congress is below 20%, and cockroaches are more respected than members of Congress, we can take any help we can get. And as a lawmaker, I have a duty to understand and assess new technologies like AI. And that's why my colleague, John Delaney from Maryland, and I created the Bipartisan AI Caucus. This caucus is a perfect forum for lawmakers to be educated and understand the issues and policy impacts surrounding AI. Our motto is, first we educate, then we legislate. And this provides a forum to learn the benefits as we gauge the risks in this emerging field. However, as John and I discussed our future, we noticed that further action was needed to prepare Congress for this transformation in our nation as well. We had to ensure that innovation is not stifled because of a harsh regulatory climate. And that's why together we introduced a bipartisan, bicameral, I'll say that one more time, listen closely, bipartisan, bicameral bill called the Future of AI Act. We had two Senate colleagues join us, Todd Young from Ohio and Maria Cantwell from Washington. The intent of this bill is to see how government can develop and create an environment that allows AI to flourish and provide further efficiencies to the marketplace. The key to achieving this is by supporting the unbiased development and application of AI, protecting privacy rights of individuals in big data sets, and preparing the workforce for the upcoming changes and the fears they have going forward. Today's panel is titled, "The Future Has Begun, Artificial Intelligence to Transform Government." This is a timely discussion as government at all levels, from local officials to state officials to executive branch agencies, are in the process of reviewing AI to determine how it can be used to help better serve the public and keep our promises to them. We have only begun to scratch the surface on how this developing technology will be used to help the public. More discussions like the one taking place today are needed to make sure that throughout the country and the world, this technology thrives. One example of how AI works, I'll give you a number, 121 days. Who knows what that means in this room? AI knows. AI knows I'm from Houston, Texas. AI knows I played basketball in high school. #1 team of state. Basketball in college. I'm a sports junkie. AI knows we have sports teams in Houston, pro teams. The Texans, football team. The Rockets, baseball team. We have the Rockets basketball team, the Astros baseball team. They know that. That number I mentioned, they all don't know. What AI knows, that date is the date since my Houston Astros have won the World Championship. The World Series champs are Houston Astros. Thank you. Have a great conference. Let's make this happen.
Thank you, Congressman Olson, and thank you for your leadership, the bipartisan, bicameral leadership to get stuff done here. So it really is a pleasure to have all of you here. We do have a terrific panel. Before the panel, a conversation around the report, the research that was done. I want to thank, again, IBM and the Center for the Business of Government, particularly Dan Chenuk, Claude Eust, and Haynes Cooney, who has actually spent some time over here. You'll also hear from Nancy Bohannon shortly here. On the partnership side, I would be remiss not to recognize, in particular, Peter Kamasai, who hopefully, he's not only helped draft the report, but is actually moving chairs now, too. And just a phenomenal colleague and done a really wonderful job on this project. So thank you, Peter. Jamie Winters, Mallory Bowman, who's our head of our research, and Ellen Perlman, who's on our communications team, all contributed to this effort. So you heard from the congressman. I'm actually not a sports fan. I'm a chess fan, and I am not very good, but I am deeply impressed with Deep Blue and what it was able to do and demonstrate in the late 1990s in defeating the world champion in an extraordinary display of what AI is capable of doing. And IBM has been on this road for a very long time and applying this in many contexts. What I am excited by is the research that we're seeing about what's happening inside the federal environment. And fundamentally, we have a legacy government that is bluntly not keeping up with the world around it. That becomes even more problematic as the world changes at an increasing velocity. And one area where that change is most pronounced is in the context of AI. And you see AI in all aspects of our life today. But I don't believe that across the board the government is actually keeping up with that change that's occurring in the general experience that most of the public has, and that has to change. One of the more exciting aspects, though, is that pretty much everything that should be happening in government is happening somewhere, typically just not in as many places it needs to be. And there's not an architecture to actually surface bright spots and to be able to identify places that good things are happening that ought to be replicated across the larger organization. And again, that's part of the intent behind this research, is really to help surface some of those great things that are occurring already and to try to find out how they're happening, who's doing it, and how we make sure that becomes the general norm across government. So with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Nancy to talk a little bit more about our report and what we found, and I hope you'll enjoy the conversation. So thank you so much.
I'm a little vertically challenged. I left my shoes on the counter, so I'm really short today. Thank you, Max, and special thanks to the Congressman Olson for the insightful remarks and, frankly, his leadership across Congress, bringing this technology to the forefront so we can all leverage it and better support our citizens. It's incredibly exciting to see all the efforts that he's doing and the Congress support. I am Nancy Bohannon, and I run the Civilian Agencies and Federal Healthcare for IBM. But more specifically, IBM Center for the Business of Government is really excited about our partnership and our collaboration with the partnership of being able to release our study today of government innovators and an incredibly distinguished government panel. IBM, as well as the broader industry, sees AI as a game changer. There is no doubt this is the next generation of computing, and it's incredibly exciting. We'll see some great examples today around law enforcement, healthcare, as well as statistical analysis. Today, this event really represents a deep collaboration with the partnership that we continue to thrive and want to drive more and more, Max, and so we're excited. Now, without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce our speakers that will present the findings from today. We have Mallory Bullman, the Director of Research for the partnership, and we also have Claude Euste, the IBM representative who runs cognitive across public sector. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and thank you to all of you for joining today in person and on the live stream, including my sons who have a 2-hour delay. So I know many people really struggled getting here today. Claude and I are really excited to share this work with you. You know, as many of the early speakers have said, this is really exciting. We're in a time in government where we're not in a position to do more with more. We're really trying to look for that option C. What is that other option? What is the way to do things differently to achieve critical outcomes? And that's where the idea for this project really began. This was a toe in the water and a chance to find some great examples that are happening at the state level, at the local level, at the federal level, and find what's out there, what could be brought to scale and replicated elsewhere. And so what Claude and I are going to start off the morning by doing is talking about, you know, what did we see out there? What are some of these case studies? And then we'll have a panel come up and really talk about the potential here. We interviewed more than a dozen folks about the work that they're doing. We talked to scholars, we talked to practitioners, and really started to get a sense of the potential here. So with that, going to go to a first case study. I'll turn it over to Claude.
Thanks, Mallory. Maybe to set the stage as we talk about these examples, one thing is we're talking about AI, but really we're talking about problems to solve. And what we found looking at all of these examples and others that are hopefully going to be in future information we share with you is no one sets out to do AI projects. That's not the ambition. The ambition is people have problems to solve. And a lot of time they've been stymied in terms of how far they can get with a solution. And the question is, what is the difference that AI brings to the equation that makes problems go away better, more effectively? So when we go through these 4 examples, we'll spend a little bit of time giving you the context of the question that was being asked, and then we'll talk about, so what does it mean that AI got involved in solving this problem? The other thing is, keep in mind, AI is young. It's actually not really young. People have been doing artificial intelligence-related topics for many years, for decades, algorithms and the like. But the explosion around machine learning, some of the things we're going to talk about, has been something that's really grown prominent recently in the last decade, 15 years or so. So these are all works in progress. And that's how we ought to think about them, and that there's opportunity to learn from them and extend them. So let's talk about fighting crime more effectively. The question here ultimately is, if you have a limited amount of resources and you have to apply them to a problem of solving crime, where do you put them? Where does it have the best effect? And this particular case started off, and you will talk about wildlife rangers in a minute, but it started off with airport security. University of Southern California was doing work with some government agencies who had a limited amount of police to patrol an airport. But they did need to intercept anybody with bad intentions. So how do you put the people in the best location in order to anticipate those who have harm in mind and then get the benefit of that? And the challenge was people are predictable. The bad people can be predictable, but our police officers can be predictable too. They can follow set patterns of investigating and looking for things. So how do you randomize this to find the opportunity to catch the culprit more effectively? And that's really what happened with wildlife. In this case, the notion was people poach. They take animals, many of them a highly endangered species, but they're difficult to catch because these are clever folks. They've been doing it for years. It's a lot of ground to cover. They can hide, wait until you leave, and then go out and do what they're doing. So the idea behind the application of artificial intelligence in fighting crime was, how do you look at the pattern of what occurred in the past? And from that pattern, how do you determine where we should go patrol next in order to find that bad person and prevent them from committing the crime, anticipate it? And the point of machine learning in this instance was understand from experience. One of the things we'll talk about a little bit is this concept of machine learning. Machine learning comes up a lot. And this is what machine learning means. In the traditional, as the Congressman pointed out, big cold rooms with big mainframes, when we wrote applications for those systems, you had to explicitly describe everything you wanted that application to do. You spent a long time listing everything that was required and then writing the program. Machine learning changes the stage a little bit. It says, if I have a lot of examples, can I use artificial intelligence to examine them and infer from examining them what they mean? I don't have to tell it what to do. It learns from looking at many examples. So what they did in this case was find examples of where poachers had set traps and fed that into the system, and the geography, the layout of the terrain. And that gave the artificial intelligence the basis to start saying, here are places where you should anticipate an event occurs. So when you go on patrol, don't do your usual rounds. Go this way this time. Because you're more likely to surprise them, you're more likely to find an event that you're trying to capture. So that's an instance not only of AI learning, but if you think about it, AI being reused, starting with airport security, looking at poaching, and a lot of the opportunity with AI is the ability to take existing models and reapply them elsewhere. Mallory?
Terrific. The next example is making tedious things a thing of the past. If we promised that you could eliminate parts of your job that were tedious, it sounds like a pretty good thing. Again, we were talking about what was the problem that folks were trying to solve. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is responsible, among many things, for monitoring the millions of workplace injuries and illnesses that occur every year, and really helping to understand what happened that led to that injury or illness. Every year, researchers at the Bureau were reading about 300,000 reports of injury and illness every year, and going through a process that they call coding, identifying the type of injury or illness, the body part that was hurt, the cause, any number of different things to really look at the root cause. What they started to do is using AI to simplify this process. Now, they started small. This is something we talk about a lot in government, is that you don't try everything at once. You try a piece of it. So they started with maybe 5% of the data, and over time have built where about 50% of the data are coded using artificial intelligence. What they have found has been nothing short of remarkable. They've shaved months of time off of the process. The AI has actually been more accurate in the coding than the individuals have been. And what they've been able to do is take those employees' time and put it towards more strategic action. So it really becomes a retention tool in terms of keeping people engaged in their work and really focusing on how to make things better for the American public.
Thank you. Helping vulnerable populations, picking up on what Mallory said just a little bit ago, there's a lot of information out there. So put yourself in the shoes of a social worker. They've got a caseload, which the ones I've interacted with is heavy, a lot of people to pay attention to. And all those cases have a lot of information associated with them. So if you want to try to help the individuals that you're interacting with, you can either choose to spend a lot of time on a few people and others are going to get less attention, or you're going to have to spread yourself thin. That's the reality of the job. It's probably the reality of a lot of jobs, frankly, in our government, where there's a lot of work to be done. There's no shortage of work, and the question is, how do you prioritize your time to get the best benefit? In the case of helping the vulnerable population, the issue was in Johnson County, Kansas. There are people who have high recidivism that are in jail. They get arrested, and they're back. There's also a pretty good correlation that individuals who are challenged with mental illnesses are more likely to be in jail because of the situations they face in their life. So the question became, knowing that and knowing other factors going on in their lives, how can you anticipate who's the most at risk? How can you help them? How can you keep them from falling into this pattern, which is counterproductive for everybody? So what Johnson County did was they said, there's a bunch of sources of data out there. Our people don't have time to look at all of them and assimilate them and make sense of it. But if an AI system could look at data in different departments, different organizations, get a cohesive view of what's going on with that individual, could we predict who's the most likely at risk? And could we take some action then to help them preemptively? Because the theme that they're really focused on is, let's not just help them after they've been arrested, let's keep them out of jail. Let's help them before the event occurs. And that was the concept where how they used AI. Think of it as many pockets of information, not a surprise. We see that everywhere, right? And then using technology of AI to read those pockets of information and then combine it, again, with these concepts of machine learning and others to say, what does that mean? Is this person at risk? How should I interpret what's going on? How should I take action to help them? So again, the business question here, or the problem statement here, is people with too much information on their hands trying to do their job. And how can they use something as an assistant to assimilate it? The Congressman made a point, that people look at AI a little fearfully sometimes, and they think about it as a replacement for people. And this is a great example. It's not a replacement for a social worker or a caseworker. You still need someone with judgment who's thinking about the individual and helping them. AI is that individual's assistant, taking care of the grunt work, gathering the data, providing the details so that you can read it and decide, I should take this action. Not what they have time to do, but what they want to do in order to serve that individual better. Mallory?
Terrific. I'm going to talk about an exciting topic of federal acquisitions. Nothing gets people quite as excited as the FAR.
Best for last.
Exactly, best for last. But if I told you you could simplify acquisitions and not have to read the FAR in lengthy detail, most people would be thrilled. What we find with the acquisitions process is people tend to go with what they know. It is a complex regulatory structure. People tend to look for what they know will work rather than where is there opportunity for innovation and saving time and saving money. And so the Department of the Air Force, which does billions of dollars in acquisitions every year, really started a process to figure out how AI can be helpful. And to take a point that Claude was saying, it really depends on the information that is going into the machine learning. They are spending time right now uploading the federal acquisition regulations. They are uploading the defense federal acquisition regulations, questions and answers, all of the pieces of information that an individual would need to make better and more strategic decisions. They're investing tremendous time on that because what they know is something that's really important with AI is that data fundamentally matters, and making sure that you have the right inputs into the AI system really matters. If you have garbage going in, you're going to get garbage going out. And so the Department of the Air Force is undergoing a process right now. And by the end of this year, what they are anticipating is that they'll have sort of a Google for acquisition within the Air Force, that individuals will be able to put in the things they want to do, and this AI system will help them answer how to do it legally, strategically, efficiently, and effectively. And the potential there is really huge in terms of helping government do its work better.
Perfect.
So before you get started, go ahead.
There you go. There you go. So if you think about these four examples, and we talked to other organizations as well, and we tried to distill it down to some, what do you take away from all that? How do you get started? Because a question that's often out there is, all right, interesting, but where do I take it first, right? How do I look at it? How do I begin? So point number one is, and we really truly mean this, AI is not meant to be peanut butter that you put on every sandwich that you make. It isn't going to solve every problem. There's a challenge sometimes that AI is confused with magic, right? Especially if you watch entertainment. Fantastic, brilliant stuff, you point at a screen, magic happens. Not the case. It takes a lot of work. But the idea is start with that business question, as we were saying before. Don't start with where's the best place that I can use AI. Start with where do I have business problems that seem intractable, and how can I help those business problems accelerate? Usually AI serves best in what we call unstructured information. All of the examples that you saw before, it's the sort of stuff like when you take notes. It's not numbers by themselves. It's content, it's pictures, it's video, audio, that sort of thing. So be selective, first of all. Number two, there's an upfront investment in all of this. Part of that investment, as the Congressman was saying, is education. What is it able to do? What is it not able to do? How do you define AI for your organization? It has a strategic value. It isn't something that you just do tactically 15 times and hopefully the pieces come together. You ought to think strategically, but there's real merit in looking at this and saying, if I were to go and approach this, I have to think ahead about the kind of organization I need, the knowledge, the skills, the investment in data and other technologies and techniques. But that doesn't mean that you ought to immediately tackle a great big thorny problem. In fact, we strongly encourage that you don't. Because AI is, in one sense, on a learning curve. If you were to think of aircraft, AI is Kitty Hawk. We're getting down the slope, we're flying over the sand, and we're going to bump into the ground not too far from now. We don't have supersonic transports. We're going to get there, but it's not there yet. So AI is really best suited to pick a small initiative around a problem, test it, learn from it. If it pays out, extend it to another phase. If it pays out, maybe that's something you ought to make production ready over time. But don't take the gamble that says, I think AI could help, so I'm going to just take the big leap And then we'll see if it pays out in the long run. It probably won't work out well. You should anticipate some number of the things you pick are not going to be what you expected. Some that you thought were low payoff may turn out to be the big thing. You don't know up front necessarily, so it's best to take it in steps and let it prove itself. I had an interesting question asked to me the other day that says, it's not like there's tons of money floating around in the government to be spent on things. So how do you fund AI? And my view is, really, by that third point, pick something that can prove that it can pay its way, but let it do so incrementally, versus let's go spend a bunch of stuff. Money, infrastructure, and everything, and then we'll figure out what happens in the long run. Mallory, and I'm taking up too much time, so I'll be quieter.
No, terrific. Okay, I'll be quick as well, because I made the first point already. It's always about the data. That it really matters what type of information goes into the AI system, because that is going to be the basis of the learning. You want to make sure that you have a robust information infrastructure to really help this learning process. The next piece, agency expertise in artificial intelligence could boost AI's potential. You are at the partnership this morning, so we're going to talk about talent. It always comes down to the people. You want to make sure that people are managing the change, people are deciding the work that is going to happen, and that people are really responsible for shepherding this work. As Claude said, this isn't magic. It is really a deliberate decision and a tool among many for implementing an agency's work. And the other part, too, is government could work with outside experts, particularly at colleges and universities. It takes a village. We know that in government, there's really no problem that's addressed by any one agency, one level of government, or one sector. And this is an area and an opportunity where there is really a wealth of expertise, actually in this room, but also around the country and around the world. And there really is a community of folks who are excited about this work. And with that, I want to introduce my colleague, Dan Chenuk, to lead us through an exciting panel discussion. Thank you. Do this. I'll put it over here. I don't think
Can I have the panel join up? So thank you, Mallory and Claude. That was a terrific discussion of the report's findings. And the center, of course, as has been mentioned by Nancy, is so happy to be continuing to work with the Partnership for Public Service on this and so many other issues. We have a great collaboration, and we look forward to more in the future. For those of you that don't know, the Center for the Business of Government is essentially a research group that works with government leaders in the U.S. and around the world on solving hard problems and finding ways, working with groups like the Partnership, working with the academic community, working with others in government to identify ways to address those problems. So this topic today really fits into that tradition. And I also want to thank Congressman Olson for his leadership, and not only in this event, but working with Congressman Delaney in kicking off the Congressional AI Caucus. And all of us in the community, I think, are excited to see congressional leadership in this area. The last note I take actually takes off on Mallory's last point, which is working with colleges and universities. To note that our center, of course, regularly works with authors from universities, and we have a follow-on report on this topic coming out from an author at Arizona State, a gentleman named Kevin D'Souza, some of you may know, writing on this topic as well. So look forward to that, as well as to continued work with the partnership that we'll be working, and with all of you in the larger community. So with that, I want to introduce our fantastic panel, who have great experience in this issue, one of whom actually was highlighted in the study, and two of whom are working on issues both internally in their agencies and externally with their communities. And I'll let them describe that work. But briefly to introduce it, we have Bill Wietrowski, who is the Deputy Commissioner and Acting Commissioner at the Bureau of Labor Statistics at the Department of Labor. Rick Ikeda, who at the National Institutes of Health runs a large program that Rick can talk about. And then Teresa Smetzer, who is the Director of Digital Futures at the Central Intelligence Agency. So let me just kick off the panel, and Teresa, if I can start with you, to talk about your role at the agency and how it intersects with the topic.
Well, first, thanks for inviting me. I think this is a really important conversation, and we're glad to be part of the conversation and engagement. So I welcome questions and insights from you all as much as my panelists up here. So I'm the Director of Digital Futures, which just very generally, we have the overarching mission of engaging with the public sector to understand where current technologies, industry-leading technologies and business processes are, and then helping internally to modernize, advance, and transform our missions based on those technologies. As you can imagine, artificial intelligence is one of our primary focus areas, given the impact and importance of machine learning to just about everything. So for us, artificial intelligence is an imperative. It's not something that's nice to have or that we should consider at some point. We have an enormous exponential growth in the amount of data, the variety of data, the velocity of data, and our nation's security really depends on our ability to quickly understand what data we have, what it means, and how we're going to use it to respond to crisis, or more hopefully to prevent the crisis in the first place. So the goal is, if you could think about it, moving from a world where we are reporting on things that have happened in the world to instead anticipating those events, so that we give policymakers, we give the public, we give law enforcement the opportunity to prevent or preempt something that could affect us. I should also note that our adversaries are using machine learning and artificial intelligence against us. So it's important for us to understand for our own uses, but it's also important for us to understand how our adversaries are using it against us. There's been a lot of press lately about this issue, so I won't elaborate on that point. We've been working on machine learning and artificial intelligence for a number of years. We've got about 130 projects underway currently that we actively monitor, and very much like my IBM colleagues described, sort of starting small, really focusing on those mission use cases that are the imperative, understanding and building out the data environment and the technology environment that enables us to do rapid application of machine learning. But it's still a very early journey. So we're trying to leverage really the investment, which has grown 3 or 4 times over the last few years, in machine learning to really look to private industry and academia to help us. So what's the art of the possible? How can we really pose a challenge to industry or to academia or private individuals and get their help in understanding how could we approach this, and how could we then bring that inside to learn from. So the one point I really want to emphasize, which you touched on a little bit earlier, but this cultural issue. So a big part of the challenge in the public sector is getting people to understand what AI really is and how they can accept it or incorporate it in what they do. So we've got examples where analysts, for example, may not understand what's under the covers of a machine learning capability, and so not trust the results. So if you don't tackle this from a sort of systems perspective and think about the data, think about the technology, use the expertise that you have, and really consider the cultural implications from the beginning, it won't work. And so we've seen this time and again, and so that's a critical part of our program, is to really take that systems view and apply all of that to whatever incubations we do. The other point which my IBM colleagues made, which I couldn't agree more with, is start small with incubation, do proofs of concept, evaluate multiple technologies, multiple approaches, learn from that, and then expand on that. So that's the approach we've taken. We have the advantage that we made a strategic investment 4 or 5 years ago into a cloud computing environment, which gives us an environment to do the sort of compute that we need. So that's been a huge help, but we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to the data and the expertise and really solving our mission use cases and problems.
Thanks, Teresa. Rick, tell us about the NIH and the topic.
Sure. So at the NIH, I'm Director of Office of Research Information Systems, and in this position, I'm responsible for the reporting and the analysis of the projects that NIH funds. And basically what I'm trying to do is provide data to NIH staff so they can make data-driven decisions. One of the things that NIH is responsible for is for funding of biomedical and life sciences research across the United States and the world. Projects are funded either via internal projects, via intramural staff, where we hire scientists to pursue different projects, or by looking at proposals that are submitted by scientists from across the world and across the nation, from universities, from academic institutions, from hospitals, from research institutes, from private companies. And we decide which ones are the best and most relevant to fund, and then allow the researchers to go out and to discover what's new in the biomedical and life sciences fields. We've used machine learning, and we started into this area maybe 8 to 10 years ago. I'll talk a little bit more about the applications within house and then talk a little bit about the research for funding outside the NIH. Within NIH itself, from the extramural side, or in other words, the granting side, one of the things that we do is to categorize all of our spending into 280 different categories. And to do this, we create a catalog of about 500,000 projects and categories each year to report publicly. To do this manually would take about 700 full-time equivalents, but we do it in an automated fashion with text mining with about 10% of the expense of the manual effort would require. So this is one of the efficiencies we've established. But right now, it's a rules-based text mining system. We establish the categories in a manual fashion. We set up rules that allow research projects to be categorized into these different areas. What we've been experimenting with is a more machine learning environment where we give it, here are the projects we think should belong to this category, and go out and find other projects which belong to the category. And that's the direction we're headed in, and it's being piloted right now. The other effort we've done in pilot was actually with collaboration with Watson Health about 2.5 years ago when they had like 5 employees. And we actually took a look at our clinical trials projects that are funded via NIH and asked, can we predict whether or not these clinical trials will actually publish their results? And for clinical trials, publishing is critical. In most scientific publications, you only see the results from positive experiments. But with clinical trials, you have to know what worked and what didn't work, because what didn't work is also important. And so publishing results, whether it's positive or negative for a clinical trial, is exceptionally valuable. And we have encouraged our scientists and clinicians to publish their work. We wanted to be able to predict whether or not they would or not. And so this gave us some variables to look at, some clues as to what we should consider in terms of funding clinical trials. So those are the administrative within-house kinds of efforts we've taken. Outside of NIH, we started a BD2K effort, a big data to knowledge effort in 2013. And when you started looking at big data and trying to interpret big data, you immediately figured out that individuals cannot make sense of large sets of data. That you actually have to do it via machine learning, via artificial intelligence. And so we funded 13 centers across the United States looking into big data and how to interpret it. They range from centers such as the Patient-Centered Information Coordination Center, which is looking to standardize patient information across all different sorts of clinical studies, all the way to what's called a scalable knowledge engine, where they're looking to take gene function and gene interactions from different studies and correlate them in one database. What's interesting is that these 13 centers have found one central problem to work on, and that is that most people communicate via the English language or language in general. They publish their data in papers, they publish their results in papers. And so the easiest way to go after big data is to actually mine the text in papers. And that's not a simple task. You first have to identify what you're talking about, and then relations of what you're talking about and what you're doing to those entities. And doing this via rules engines is the historic way of doing it, but all you do is you end up looking at terms such as nouns, but they're nouns that have different meanings, such as mercury. Mercury can be a planet, it's an element, but unless you know the context of that discussion, you don't know whether you're talking about the planet or the element. And so the 13 centers have gotten together to look at how they would actually text mine data from the literature, looking at both the text, the figures, the tables, and trying to determine what's there in terms of how the author has described their results. And so they've worked together to apply deep learning and machine learning to parsing natural language out of text to be able to identify what's there and what they're talking about. And one of the projects that's being pursued right now is an example is at the Big Data to Knowledge Clinical Center called the Mobilize Center. Basically, they're looking at about 500,000 clinical notes on 3,500 knee and hip transplant or knee and hip replacement patients and looking at the symptoms and their outcomes. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to devise a method to be able to predict going into a knee replacement or a hip replacement what complications or outcomes might occur in this patient and what the doctor should be looking for once they finish their procedure. So those are the things that are going on at the NIH.
Thanks so much, Rick. And the Mercury example makes me think that, the context of that could also be the Roman god or even the lead singer for Queen.
That's correct. There's more than, there can be multiple synonyms.
Many meanings. So, Bill, we had the benefit of hearing about what's happening at BLS. Can you expand on what's happening in the agency?
Sure. So thanks very much for inviting me and for including the Bureau of Labor Statistics in this report. So we are the agency that was one of the examples in there about trying to work through routine tasks more quickly. And so if you're not familiar with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we're not fighting crime and we're not curing cancer, but we are doing our best to provide gold standard data to help Americans make the best decisions that they can. And the example that you saw in the report has to do with our workplace safety and health data, which in fact is helping employers and employees to be safer on the job, and something that our staff takes very seriously. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we've been around for over 130 years. We're the people that put out the employment data once a month that came out last Friday, the Consumer Price Index that will come out this Friday, and a variety of other economic indicators that people do use to make decisions. So as you can imagine, we are processing millions of data points every month, and we're always looking for ways to do that in a more efficient way. So we really focus on being accurate and being consistent. And so one of the ways that we work on being consistent is that we try to slot data into classification systems. So an occupation or an industry, or in the case of our occupational safety and health data, by the nature of the injury or the part of body or the event that led to the particular incident. But as you can imagine, there's millions of these data points, and sort of figuring out how to classify them was typically a human process that took a lot of time. So I'll give you an example from one of our recent workplace injury surveys. So we get narrative information to identify a worker and the injury that occurred. And so we got, in 1 year, over 200 distinct job titles to represent either a janitor or a cleaner. We have one occupation, we want to slot them in. But when an employer tells us what was the job of the person who got hurt, they use 2,000 different names. And 80% of them never use the word janitor or cleaner. So traditionally, we would have staff that would review that data by hand and would determine that they belonged in occupation code X, which is the janitor and cleaner. That's something that we can now use machine learning to improve the consistency and also just increase efficiency overall of working on those data. So we're fortunate to be able to develop our machine learning capabilities organically within the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And we tend to have what I would say a fairly academic-minded staff, a staff that really wants to look at finding better ways to do things. We also have staff who feel very passionately about producing the right data and producing the data accurately. So I'm lucky that many of my colleagues were just curious about finding better ways to do things, and also to avoid the tedious tasks. I think that's the way the report describes the particular work we're doing, is that looking at 2,000 different names of janitors is a very tedious task, and something that people would rather be spending their time doing something that uses their skill and their knowledge in a little better way. So we've made a fair amount of progress in using machine learning to analyze text and turn that text into accurate coding. And we really did start small, and that was one of the ideas that comes out in the report. We started with our survey of occupational injuries and illnesses, and we started looking first at occupations. And occupations is one of the easier things to code, because you might imagine you have 2,000 different names of a janitor, but you look at the description, it's a janitor. Similarly, we have an awful lot of unfortunately, an awful lot of registered nurses get hurt on the job, moving patients or violence among a patient or a variety of other incidents that may occur. And so we have a lot of descriptions of a registered nurse. A registered nurse lifting a patient, hurting a back. And that's sort of a standard example that we typically give. And in fact, that's something that machine learning can help to help to make the coding of something like that happen more quickly. So we started out using logistic regression autocoder, and we started out small by just limiting it to a small number of occupations to make sure that we were doing the work well, and did a lot of review of these data. We also we built the autocoder by having some of our experts produce sort of a gold standard set of data. So the process was we looked at 1,000 injury and illness cases. We had 3 expert coders code all the characteristics of those cases based on the rules that are in place. We compared those. Even our experts didn't always agree, and we had sort of a decision-making process to come up with a final sort of gold standard file. And from that, we use that to build the first autocoder using logistic regression. So we're actually moving now, and this is where I'm lucky to have really smart people at BLS working with me. So we're working toward developing deep neural networks. It took me a while to even know to spell the neuro and neural networks, but in fact that's making the process even more efficient, and we're able to code more and more of the data. I think the report said that we moved from coding 5% of the codes to now coding over 50% of the codes, and we're moving farther and farther in that area. So the machine learning transforms the way we take the narrative information that employers give us and turn that into the coding of the data that we're able to release to the public. So we've learned a lot from the process through the survey of injuries and illnesses. We're moving that process to some of our other surveys where we code occupation, or we code industry, or we code other areas. And another area that we think is really ripe is the data review process. So in reviewing data, our staff are often looking for patterns in the data and sort of inconsistencies in those patterns. And machine learning can really help in that area. So we're really excited to be able to sort of move forward in this area. And so I look forward to talking more about it.
Thank you, Bill. And what a great model for other statistical agencies in the government. So much of what the government does is to collect information and make it available for public use. And you've really led the way in harnessing the technology. So let's get into a little bit of a discussion, and then we'll open it up for a discussion with the audience as well. We talked and talked before about some of the concern, the cultural change. Teresa, you talked about this within the agency in terms of the business case and making the investment. How do you talk to your colleagues, especially for our federal colleagues here today, about how do you move forward? What are the benefits of AI that justify the investment?
I think one of the things we've done is to look at edge use cases, if you will. So if we can do some things using machine learning in parallel with what our mission folks already do, and then show them how that helps them and how they can gain confidence in what the application is, we found that to be successful. So it still takes time, but they have to be involved. It has to be mission driven, but they have to be able to see the value. And so that's one of the things that we've found successful.
Rick, anything from?
I'd agree that the theme of starting small is the way to go. At NIH, there's the enterprise level IT systems, which would be an expensive place to basically integrate an AI system. Right. But you can start with the institutes and centers themselves, where they have an issue that they need to tackle that takes a lot of time. And they have a little more flexibility than the enterprise does, and they can experiment and start small with a problem. And then finding out if it's successful or not, move it to the enterprise once that's proven.
And was there learning, you talked about the internal and external. Mm-hmm. Do you try to sort of create learning on both sides where there's cross-fertilization of knowledge about AI?
Yes. In fact, one of the centers that's been working on natural language processing has put out basically shareware in terms of components for natural language processing, and it's available for our use and for anybody else's use. And so we can look at it and go, is this going to be useful in our system? And if it is, then we'll incorporate it.
Bill, anything?
The Congressman mentioned the fact of educating first, and in fact, that's exactly what we've done. And so we've started, one, we started really small. Two, we tried to get more and more people to learn the process we were doing, to use some of the software we were using. A lot of it was open source software. We didn't have a lot of sort of large financial expenditure up front. We also started largely in our program area, so this wasn't necessarily an IT activity. It was really a program activity to say, what are we trying to do better, and how can those people who do that every day find a way to do it better. We recently added a data science users group at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and this is just a bunch of folks who are very interested in data science, interested in machine learning, interested in web scraping, who want to share knowledge and sort of gain knowledge from each other. I went to the first meeting, and the couple of things that struck me was, one, I knew almost no one in the room, which told me, and they were a whole lot younger than me, and it told me that we've attracted a lot of people who've learned a lot in school and want to bring those skills to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the other thing, we went around a room and each person talked about what they were doing. And there were some little projects going on, but there was just a huge curiosity of, hey, I want to learn more about what's going on in that other office, and I want to bring that to my office. And yes, I have a tedious task, and I want to find a way to make it better. So we really have been spreading it sort of organically internally.
Yeah, we did a community of practice as well, and I agree with you. We've made a huge benefit of this. We started with 100 people. I think we now have 500 or 600 people, and literally they're practitioners of machine learning across the organization, sharing best practices, sharing which technologies they've used, which open source software they found to be helpful, and just techniques generally. And I would definitely advocate that for a federal organization.
So this gets to the point that Mallory raised about talent and the fact that you need to have skills and capabilities both within the agency and also with the partners that you work with. How do you think about building on these steps to try to expand the skills and capabilities in the workforce? What steps do you think agencies should be taking?
Well, it's very difficult given the competitive nature of machine learning expertise, right? So they can make a lot of money in the private sector. Why would they come to government? So I think what we've really tried to do is create a program where they see some value in working on our problems, and that they can learn from that even if they don't stay with us their entire career. So thinking about more temporary types of assignments, bringing in academics or experts for a short period of time to work with us that we can learn from them. The idea of just hiring somebody for a career to stay with us is not really very practical in today's world.
So BLS is fortunate in that we attract an awful lot of data geeks and people who really feel strongly about wanting to produce the best possible data. And while I've been there for some million years, but we do tend to attract people who stay for a while. And so the thing that I've noticed, I call it a sea change, is that we hire economists and statisticians and also IT staff, but in the economists and statisticians, more and more young people are coming with more and more quantitative skills, and that, to me, has been a real plus and a real difference. And so we've also encouraged sort of, I won't say cheap, I'll say inexpensive ways of training through Coursera and things like that, where people are really learning sort of little skills as they need them along the way.
I agree. There's a generational set of qualifications that come up, and that the younger staff members definitely have more quantitative skills and more immersed in the data. And actually, part of implementing a machine learning system within an agency is to manage the change management through your entire staff, not just the younger generation, but the older generation also.
Have you run across challenges, either in the workforce area or in sort of the technology area, that you've developed, you came across and created some sort of a roadblock or obstacle that you had to overcome? What lessons did you learn from challenges along the way?
Well, I think as the study pointed out, I mean, data is always the biggest challenge. And so getting sufficient quantities of training data for any sort of program or initiative is always a problem. So, we're looking more and more at synthetic data, for example, and really getting synthetic data that emulates our actual data as a way to train. That's probably been one of our biggest immediate problems, is getting that training data really applied to whatever the machine learning project is.
So I'd agree that the data is the first hurdle. It's got to be there. It's got to be accessible, and it's got to be clean enough for you to use. But then the real hurdle becomes the people. Are your experts going to accept the results that are coming out of the system? And if they don't, then you have a problem there because they won't use it. But they also have to have buy-in to the training. They actually have to be available to train the system. And if they're not invested in that system, then they're not going to give you good training data.
Right.
So I think one of the things we tried to do is to bring some experts into the process all along. And so I mentioned that we built a gold standard file, which was that training data, and we had experts who really knew the data to be involved in that process. But I will say that the people that traditionally coded our data, they thought that some robot was going to take over their job, and they also didn't necessarily trust that the robot knew the nuances of the data, in fact, the way that they did. And they had been coding janitors and registered nurses for 40 years, and so they knew how to code them. And in fact, one, starting small really helped. Two, showing them the results and the accuracy of the results really helped. And three, the fact that machine learning couldn't do everything. And in fact, it was the difficult cases, the ones that they enjoyed sort of noodling over and finding the right answer to, that were still theirs. The machine would say, I can only find an answer with 10% confidence for this particular code, and so you go find it. And so it sort of gave them the challenging work that I think they really enjoyed. And so I think that balance helped a whole lot.
Interesting. The flip side of that, of course, is the benefits. Is how do you look out and see, sort of either in the agency or in the world of partners that your agency works with, what are the benefits that AI is bringing to the mission space? And Teresa, I know a large part of your job that you talked about is looking outside. What have you found sort of as the benefits that you can bring into the agency?
I think the use cases in the commercial sector that are similar or analogous to our challenges, where people can see, oh, that's interesting, that really does relate to me. So if you think about multimodal machine learning or artificial intelligence, where you've got video and audio and text, and seeing what is possible in the private sector and then showing people how that relates to their job, that's been helpful, at least.
Any other thoughts on benefits?
So one of the people we fund on the extramural side is Dr. Olivier Letarge at Baylor. And what he's set up is a text mining system which he's used to mine the literature. And what he's shown is that he can actually create machine-generated scientific hypotheses that you can go out and test. Right. And so this gives the experts and the program officials at NIH a place to start when they're thinking about a new problem.
Just from the perspective of a government agency, resources are just not generally available. And so I know in our safety and health program, we've lost staff and have not been able to replace them. So being able to have a more efficient process when we don't have the staff available, we're always looking at sort of doing more with less. Also being able to get the data out in a more timely manner to improve the accuracy, and we've shared our knowledge and some of our code with partners at NIOSH, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. Also, the other statistical agencies you mentioned, starting out. And I think we've been at the forefront of this among the statistical agencies, and I'm happy to share that. So I think there's a lot of benefits to sort of getting the word out.
Terrific. Well, one more question, and then we'll turn it to our audience for discussion. Take your crystal ball out. Think 5 to 10 years in the future. Where do you see your agency with regard to its maturity and use of AI?
So for us, nirvana would be that we know where all our data is. It's tagged in a manner that we can access it, that it's appropriately secured, because for us, security is, as you can imagine, a challenge, and that we can use that data on the fly to make decisions about our business and what we do, but also to protect the country, and we can do it securely, and we can deliver results in a timely fashion in a manner that is useful to our customers. So that would be nirvana. Not sure we'll get there in 10 years, but that's where we're headed.
Okay. Rick?
So in 5 to 10 years, I hope that we have a system that can actually read papers and determine the intent of what the author is actually getting at. And the reason is that we need to actually be able to balance our scientific portfolio, what we fund across what's coming up, what's new, versus what needs to be preserved in terms of research. And to do that, you need to know what's out there and how it's being approached.
So the world of statistical agencies is changing, and the traditional survey of households of employers is getting more and more difficult. And we're in a world of big data, where there's lots of data sets out there, and people are producing data all the time. And BLS and other agencies are looking at using some of those alternative data sets to supplement what we already have. We need to make sure they're consistent. We need to make sure we can code them in the right way. So I think the steps we've taken in our injury and illness survey are just a first step to many of the programs across BLS, and also very much to our review process. So when I started a million years ago, I reviewed everything by paper, and there was lots of fan-fold pages that I would turn over and over. I now have a lot of staff who spend a lot of time staring at screens and making review decisions. And I think the world of machine learning can help that process go more quickly. We can do it with fewer people. We can get the data out more quickly and be as accurate or more accurate as we've been.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks for the great insights to the entire panel. We have a wealth of knowledge here, so I encourage the audience to ask questions. Either of our panelists, also, if you have a question about the report, I'll try to field it. If I can, I'll probably lateral over to Claude or Mallory. So who wants to go first? Yep, in the back. And please identify yourself.
Patricia Grime, Health and Human Services, Office of the National Coordinator, Health Information Technology. I heard the theme of sharing across government. I heard NIH making shareware available. I heard Bureau of Labor Statistics coordinating with NIOSH. And I was interested in the CIA report, Teresa, where you said that, with this explosion in talent and the need to coordinate, even internally, what kinds of collaborative platforms are available, being used right now to share what's happening throughout government in AI?
So we were just talking about that this morning, actually, and for us, we have an added challenge of the information is classified, so it's not something we can make broadly available across federal government. But what we can make available and what we have talked about is techniques and methods and algorithms, and which various commercial technologies have been more useful than others, and so on. This is an early growth sort of project within the federal government, where we're trying to figure out how to collaborate in a way that makes sense. I mean, just within the national security community, there's a lot of agencies and organizations that are involved. So I don't have an answer for you, except to say that's something that's really at the forefront. I would characterize this as artificial intelligence is forcing people to think horizontally instead of vertically, which is not a normal kind of federal government sort of mindset. So how do we share these ideas and examples across the national security space, at least, if not the government more broadly over time?
Bill, you talked about sharing across the statistical community. Are there platforms or mechanisms for doing
so? I sort of have the same answer that Teresa does, is that I don't, right now, I don't know of platforms for doing that. We are really, it's sort of a one-on-one or one-on-several discussion, and part of it is the confidentiality of the data that we collect. So we pledge confidentiality to those individuals and employers that provide our data, and we don't want to release anything that's going to represent a particular employer or a particular household. And so even in some of the data we've shared with NIOSH, we've had to strip some of the data off that might represent a particular employer. So right now, it's really a one-on-one activity, but we are very open to having those discussions and to seeing what it is we can provide, or what training or learning we can provide to other agencies. We're happy to do that.
It also strikes me that the Congressional AI Caucus, since it works across multiple committees, authorizing committees, can create platforms for agencies to get together with congressional support. And I know the General Services Administration is doing work sort of supporting a lot of government-wide activity in this arena as well. Yes, in the back.
Good morning. My name is Nilesh Shalat from USAID. Thank you for a great presentation. In this incredibly competitive world we're in right now, in your all's opinion, how do we rank vis-a-vis our adversaries? How is China doing in this space? How is Russia doing in this space compared to us? And to that point, in order to compete with them, how do we make it easier for real private sector partners to partner with the government to want to do this? Because right now it's a little tough and it's a bit of a pain for the private sector to want to partner with government to make us more competitive, frankly, with some of our adversaries.
So there's been a lot written in the public sector about China and Russia and Putin said 6 or 8 months ago that whoever won the AI war would dominate the world. I mean, that's sort of, the Chinese government has made it clear that their investment in AI is critical and has funded all kinds of initiatives and efforts to essentially realize that goal. So it's pretty wide and broad in terms of the understanding of what their intent is. For us, I think it's really taking the view of protecting U.S. interests and protecting our people. And so, I can't get into the details, but that is obviously something that's of utmost concern in terms of making sure that we understand what others are doing and how it might impinge on our safety.
Rick, do you work with international partners in this space?
We do, but not as broadly as we would wish. One of the things I'd like to point out is that unlike a lot of other technologies, AI is really being pushed by the consumer end. Alexa, Tesla in terms of self-driving cars, Google in terms of its search algorithms. There's a lot more public activity out there than people realize. And it's really those operations that have been putting AI in the forefront of everyone's mind and really driving a lot of the technologies.
To some extent, that's why we're here. Your question is a terrific one, especially in terms of the public-private partnership and the work that the Partnership for Public Service does with government, that the IBM Center does, working with IBM, business colleagues, and other colleagues from companies all over Washington and really all over the country to try to say, how can we bring, as Teresa talked earlier, how can we identify the art of the possible? Maybe it's consumer-driven, and it creates applications in government to enable the U.S. to maintain a competitive advantage relative to other countries. So I think it's a great question and one that we all need to be focusing on going forward. Right here.
Jason Barron. I work at Draper Middle. I was director of litigation at the National Archives. I have been an evangelist for AI for lawyers in the e-discovery space. But I also have watched the movie Minority Report and am a big fan of every episode of Black Mirror. And so the question for me, especially on case study number 3, where AI is being talked about in Johnson County, Kansas, people who are most likely to be arrested, raises issues for me about whether there should be some oversight in the form like an IRB, but an algorithmic review board of some kind to monitor projects like that so that we have transparency, especially when government is involved at either a state level or at the federal level, creating databases or otherwise, that we have some level of transparency and oversight when algorithms are deployed by government.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Rick, you deal in the world of IRBs, and have you adapted the process for AI in any different way?
Well, most of our IRBs are external. They're basically at the universities, at the research institutes, looking at the proposals that are coming in. And we haven't really gotten that many in terms of specifically, most of it's been theoretical. It's been on pre-existing data, which doesn't necessarily require an IRB. And so I think it's an issue that needs to be tackled.
For Claude and Mallory, did Johnson County, do you know, in the research, did they set up any sort of a review oversight process for that? Or was it, since they were starting small, did they kind of start and then work?
I think it was more of...
Okay. So the University of Chicago and their review board. So an interesting model. Good question as we move forward.
But I also think, and I think I'm still on mic, that you raise a really important point, though, with AI, and something, frankly, that, this report was sort of a toe in the water, but I think there's a larger conversation around the ethics of this, so that we always assume that it was put into an algorithm, so it's correct. There are assumptions when you create an algorithm, and there are assumptions in the data that are the inputs. And so I think the question you raise is spot on, of that, as we think about what this looks like as we bring it to scale, there's both the technology piece, there's the talent piece, and there's the ethics or the decision-making piece. And I think, again, that was something I think that we're hoping to get into in some subsequent work, but we didn't explore as much here, and I think that's a really salient point.
So I'd just like to point out that IRBs are familiar to those that do biomedical research, but IRB is for human studies in general. And there are lots of evaluation studies which should be subjected to an IRB approval, but aren't, because people don't think of it as a human study.
Interesting. There was a question over here.
I'm Carl Schneider. I'm the Deputy Chief Management Officer of the Army. I think the question about the ethics of it is very important. Thank you. We did a very large study on suicides in the Army. And one of the results was there's a subset of soldiers who we could say the probability of suicide is greater for them. And the question was, so what do I do with that? As a line person who's trying to make something work, what do I do with that information? Do I treat them differently? Do I annotate their files? I know that the false positives are very high in that area. That of the several thousand people we identify, maybe 100 will actually attempt suicide. So what am I doing to the 1,900? That am I disadvantaging them? Am I keeping them from promotion, from assignments, things like that? So working through that question, I think, is really important. The question I have for the panel is, what about visualization of data? So I'm an operator. I'm trying to get things done, so I'm a consumer of the work that you're talking about. A topographical map is a great array of data because it lets me see relationships and everything. So what are we doing to try to help people like me use the work that you all do to make decisions to govern?
Bill, you talked about people looking at the screens and adapting the application.
So the Bureau of Labor Statistics has done a lot of work in visualizations to try to, in two ways. One, internally to try to help people to review data, and two, sort of externally to get our data out to the public in sort of a more accessible way. But we've not yet sort of merged the machine learning work with this visualization. So an example is in our producer price index data, we now have a internal visualization program that helps people identify outliers and oddball data before they're published. But that is using sort of the rule-based approach that's always been in place for, what's an oddball case. But they're not flipping paper anymore. They're not going through a million screens. They're seeing sort of a line on the screen and one dot way up here that says, what's wrong with that dot? So I think that there's very much the opportunity there to move away from that rule-based approach to a machine learning approach and do the same thing. Maybe the dots are a little different, but the same thing is, okay, my reviewer can spend 5 minutes on a small amount of information and move forward instead of those hours and hours that are there. So we're doing some visualization, we're doing some machine learning. I don't think we've really married the two just yet.
Mm-hmm. I'd say that there are two different problems. That the visualization applies not only to machine learning, but to manual analysis, manual reports. And so the problem is that you need to democratize the access to the data. Mm-hmm. And right now, what we've got is the ability to create visualizations, but it takes a while. It takes actually development work. It takes staff to actually create that visualization. I think there are tools coming online now that would allow you to be a little more agile in that kind of work. There's a couple of COTS products out there that allow you to type in an English question, and it'll present you the data in a visual form, and you can manually adjust that visual form from a graph to a bar graph to whatever you want. And so those are the kinds of things, I think, in terms of presentation that need to advance to help this become easier to use.
Yeah, I think data visualization, I agree with you that finding the data in the first place is the big challenge, but we use data visualization for all kinds of things, particularly geospatially oriented or temporally oriented or both, to be able to show complex things where there's a lot of information. I think that capability is going to get richer given the research and things like graph analytics capabilities that you could use on top of machine learning to show, if you're interested in this, here are lots of other things that might be interesting to you or relevant to you. And so those are some of the examples of where I think visualization is really going to be a key part of machine learning and understanding what you're looking at.
It's interesting. Our center a couple of years ago put out a report on data visualization for advanced analytics in government by a scholar named Jeannie Stowers, and it's an interesting set of issues to think about. How do you move that into a new era? So something for us to look at. Question here.
My name is Fletcher Honeyman. I'm with Office of Personnel Management, more specifically with the Federal Executive Institute. And my question ties to the one just precedes me concerning what are you doing in your organizations to develop your leaders to be able to use AI to help accomplish their mission, lead organizations, lead change, because you're doing it, but you know what's happening at the top level. And our role and responsibility is to provide training for the SESers and the 15s, individuals who have responsibility to make decisions. And I see this as a very powerful tool to help them. So I'd like to know what you're doing there.
Anybody want to start?
Well, I think there's certainly recognition that your point is very well taken, and that's that we need to address that, right? So having the conversation about the importance of technology and innovation across the board, not just machine learning, there are many studies that have been done that show in the corporate world that CEOs can no longer just rely on a CTO. They've got to be technically pretty savvy themselves. So it's the same for inside the federal government. I don't think we have a solution per se to the challenge that you presented, but there certainly is recognition that we need to provide training and experience and inform how leaders move up in the organization to be able to accommodate the changes that we likely will see with technology.
I think similarly, we definitely started slow, and we definitely had naysayers and managers who were concerned about, whether this was going to work and, the accuracy of the information. And so a couple of champions at a higher level were very helpful, but we don't, at least at the moment, have sort of a broader, we look at change management all the time, but we don't really have sort of a broader look at our executives to say, this is the future and you need to embrace it. So it is something that we need to always be thinking about, but I'm not sure we've quite found the solution just yet.
So at NIH, I think we're a little different because most of our senior staff are former scientists or are still scientists. And if you show them a data example, then they tend to head in that direction. And in fact, the Big Data to Knowledge effort was actually an initiative started by Dr. Collins, our director of NIH.
And Claude made the point earlier about it's really about the business problem, not necessarily about the technology, and that's the language of executives. And so if you think about what's the business problem that agency leaders are dealing with, and then where is the use case for artificial intelligence to help solve that, I think that will help have the discussion with leaders at that level as opposed to at the technology level where people tend to get lost if they're not a technologist by training.
So is IBM specifically facilitating that with their customers at that level?
So we always talk to customers across the board about linking technology to solving business and mission problems. Our ability to help the government, really to help all of our clients, is really to tie the offerings that we have and the knowledge that we have through organizations like our center to helping the government address the problem that they're trying to solve, as opposed to just sort of putting the technology before them and not really understanding how that ties to the mission issue at hand. Time for just a couple more. Yep, back here.
Hey, I'm Abigail Rockwell. I'm a PMF with the Department of State. And I actually had a question about AI regulation because like, we're not, as a government, at the forefront of developing this technology. Like, that's mostly happening in Silicon Valley and other places. And a lot of the regulation so far is getting done on sort of an agency by agency basis. Like, DOT has self-driving cars, someone else has drones, someone else is, I'm sure, overseeing Alexa or whatever. But in terms of sort of directing AI development in a direction that we think is ethical and responsible and for the greater public good, I guess, and I don't know if this is something that you guys deal with, but what's being done about that, and then on, how are we coordinating among agencies to make sure that AI is going the direction we feel it should go, and how are we keeping sort of a technical advantage? Because, right now we've got Silicon Valley and not quite our backyard, but at least in the US, but, they're not necessarily responsible to us. So.
Any thoughts on regulation and interaction with industry?
So I think there's a lot of conversations going on at this point about that very issue. As far as I know, there's not a solution or an approach, but I think certainly the Congressman spoke to the need to have a more strategic approach. Part of it's the laws, part of it's practices in the agencies. There isn't really I think it's going to take some time to come up with something that makes sense across the federal bureaucracy. As far as the Silicon Valley, though, we find that really we've had a lot of engagement from startups all the way through big companies that want to work, that have a lot of expertise. And so I think companies really see that as a benefit to them to be able to help the government. So I'm hopeful, at least, that that's going to continue.
I mean, just even in Silicon Valley, though, there's a lot of disagreement about sort of what direction AI should develop.
True.
Sort of what the responsibility of developers are.
Yep. That's true.
So I'm going to put on a little bit of my former hat. When I was in the government, I worked at the OMB, Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And one of the principles of regulations that has been carried forward from administrations of both parties is to kind of let the private sector lead, especially in new evolving areas like this, try to work with the experiments like the ones we've heard about today and learn from that rather than to try to ex ante kind of come up with rules that may or may not work for how the technology develops over the years. So learning from examples like today, learning from the models that we're hearing about from the panel, I think will help the government get to that place that you're describing, both from Silicon Valley innovation as well as innovation all over the country. Last question. Yep, right here.
Thanks. Jin Xin from U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commissioner, and I'm a human factors and human reliability engineer there. So really exciting to hear all these good stories on AI, but on the other hand, I couldn't help thinking, back to 1980, early 90, neural network, everyone was talking about neural network, and it seems neural network are going to transform everything. And after 5 or 6 years of hate of neural network, and millions of projects failed, with very, very few limited success stories. So today we definitely hear more success stories in the AI domain. So I was wondering, AI can do lots of good, but it's also very resource demanding. Have we somehow learned some good lesson, or the panelists may have some insights to share, where you should not do AI, like where we're convinced that AI is definitely better than BI, brain intelligence, or not as good as BI. For example, I cannot think that, like in the area of NIH extramural grant reviewer, to me, that's an area that BI is a lot better than AI. So I would appreciate your insight.
So
thanks.
We haven't imagined AI taking over for peer review at all. It may be coming in 100 years, but definitely not in the next 5 to 10 years. But you know, one of the things you're pointing out is that it depends on the problem you're trying to address. If you want to use neural network, you have to have thousands or tens of thousands of examples to train the system on. It may not be worth it. You may want to do a machine learning approach where it's rules-based. So it really depends on the problem you're talking about, what the acceptable solution should be, and whether it's going to be worth the time and effort to invest in a system to do that kind of task.
I very much agree. We've tried not to make this sort of an expensive proposition, but rather to identify particular problems that we think can be solved using machine learning or these approaches, and then sort of grapple those individual. Some would say, you know, we've been slow at this, but in fact, being fairly deliberate in sort of making decisions of what are the right problems to use this to address.
Yeah, I agree. It gets back to looking at the use case from the beginning and understanding where it's appropriate and where it's not appropriate to drive sort of experimentation in that area.
And I want to harken back to a comment that Claude made earlier. It's really about augmenting human decision making. That's how we think about it and how many companies working with government think about it. It's not to replace humans, but it's to help them make better decisions. And I think the examples we've heard about today illustrate that as the models move forward. So thank you for terrific questions. Thanks to our panel for great insights. And I want to again thank the partnership for their collaboration today, and we look forward to continuing the discussion with all of you in the months and years to come. Thanks a lot.